They fined me $750 for parking my own fire truck in my own driveway. Said it was an eyesore. Asterisk, I'm a retired firefighter. That truck, it's not decoration, it's protection. But the HOA didn't care. Asterisk, 3 nights later, their $20,000 cedar fence caught fire in the middle of the night. Asterisk, no fire trucks around, no sirens, just smoke, flames, and panic. Asterisk, so I rolled up in the very truck they tried to ban, lights on, hose running, and I put out that fire before it could spread to nearby homes. Asterisk, when the official crew finally arrived, light had already saved the day. Asterisk, that same HOA, they tried to thank me, tried to backpedal, asterisk, but the whole neighborhood saw what really happened. Asterisk, sometimes, the thing they call an eyesore turns out to be the only thing standing between them and disaster. I'd never thought the thing that would ignite a war in my quiet, oak-lined neighborhood would be a fire truck, especially one I owned personally, fully restored with my own hands, and parked proudly in my own driveway. But when you live under the microscopic gaze of an HOA, run by people who treat power like a personality, everything becomes a problem if it doesn't fit their idea of aesthetic harmony. In my 1976 American LaFrance pumper, bright cherry red and polished to a mirror finish, stuck out like a sore thumb in a sea of beige SUVs and overpriced landscaping. Though to me, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of the 20 years I spent running into burning buildings, while most of these keyboard warrior board members were arguing over mailbox colors and which brand of mulch the neighborhood should standardize. And when I bought the old fire engine at auction, I did it to stay sharp, to keep it for emergencies. And because, let's face it, tower response times out here are laughable, and I wanted something nearby in case someone's kitchen lit up or a brush fire crept too close to the fence line. But none of that mattered to the HOA, especially not to Harold Crenshaw, the HOA president and full-time professional busybody who acted like he was elected mayor of a major city instead of head of a volunteer board that mostly existed to collect dues and send out passive-aggressive newsletters. And within days of parking the truck in my driveway, even after making sure it was tucked in neatly, not obstructing any view or sidewalk, I got the first warning notice, a 2-page email citing some vaguely worded clause about prohibited commercial vehicles, which I immediately contested by pointing out that it wasn't being used for commercial purposes and, frankly, was no larger than some of the F-250s parked on the same street. But Harold wouldn't hear it. He claimed it projected an industrial image and reduced visual cohesion, whatever that means. And even when I explained that I was a retired firefighter, that the truck was not an eyesore but an emergency resource, and that I'd be happy to keep it covered or parked only on certain days if necessary, he refused to budge, treating the whole issue like I'd pulled a rusty food truck onto the lawn and was blasting death metal at 2 a.m. And then came the notice of fine $750 for a non-compliant vehicle parked in clear view for more than 72 hours, which was when I realized this wasn't about policy, it was about pride, about Harold's need to assert control. So I went to the next HOA meeting to fight it, thinking maybe if the rest of the board heard the logic and saw the absurdity, they'd side with reason. But when I logged onto the Zoom call, because God forbid we have in-person meetings, I found myself muted unless called upon, limited to a 3-minute argument while Harold and his fellow board members sat smugly on camera in their matching polos and nodding, like they were ruling on a federal case. And when I asked them if they'd ever consider the value of having a fire suppression vehicle within 3 minutes of every home, especially given our rural placement, one of them laughed and said, "That's what we pay taxes for," and the fine was upheld within minutes. No discussion, just a smug decision, final, and an offer to appeal to the enforcement committee, which, surprise, was chaired by Harold's cousin. So I paid the fine, not because I agreed, but because I didn't have the energy to drag it into legal territory. And I figured if the world ever burned down, at least I had water and a pump system they couldn't touch. But karma, as it often does, came faster than expected. And exactly 3 nights later, just past 2 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the emergency radio I kept on my nightstand, a habit I never broke, even after retirement. And through the static came the voice of a dispatcher reporting a structure fire near the HOA Community Park on Maple Oak Lane, which immediately rang alarm bells in my head because I knew that location. It was just down the road, where the HOA had recently installed a brand new cedar privacy fence around the community clubhouse. A project they were so proud of, they emailed everyone about it with a photo and a breakdown of the $20,000 cost. And without even thinking, I jumped up, threw on my turnout coat and boots, and ran outside to the fire truck that was still parked, shining in the moonlight. The same truck they'd just fined me for, and within 30 seconds I had it roaring to life. Lights flashing, sirens off because I didn't want to wake the whole neighborhood unnecessarily, and drove it the quarter-mile down the hill to where a glow was already visible on the horizon. An orange flicker growing brighter with every second, and when I arrived, the fence was fully engulfed, flames licking 6 feet high, smoke billowing into the air, and embers drifting dangerously close to the adjacent homes and trees. with no fire engine in sight yet because we're too far out for city units to respond quickly, and a couple of panicked residents were trying to use garden hoses to fight a blaze that was clearly too much for anything short of high-pressure suppression. So I pulled up, laid the hose, and within 60 seconds was blasting the fire with a steady stream from my onboard tank. Years of muscle memory kicking in as I adjusted pressure, fanned the spray to stop ember spread, and backed the fire down from the fence line before it could reach the dry patch of brush that would have carried it straight to 3 backyards. And as I worked, I noticed figures gathering half-asleep neighbors in robes and slippers, kids filming on phones, and right in the middle of it all, standing like a man struck dumb by his own karma, was Harold Crenshaw himself, wearing flannel, pajama pants and a shocked expression, and I didn't say a word as I kept working. As the flames dropped, the smoke thinned, and finally, nearly 15 minutes later, the first fire engine from the city rolled in. Too late to save the fence, but just in time to see the fire had already been contained by the very vehicle they said didn't belong. And the crew chief, an old colleague of mine, just gave me a look, shook his head, and said, "Well, Dave, guess you beat us to it." And the next morning the neighborhood group chat was on fire in a different way, lit up with videos, photos, and praise. People who'd never spoken to me now calling me a hero, and even some who'd sided with the HOA wondering aloud how they ever thought the fire truck was a bad idea. And by afternoon, the local news had shown up, wanting to do a story. Retired firefighter saves HOA property with truck, HOA fined him for... And Harold, who once loved the spotlight, refused to speak to reporters, claiming it was a private matter. But the damage was done, and though he tried to spin the event as a wake-up call for tighter safety procedures, everyone saw it for what it was, a stunning example of hypocrisy, lit up in 20-foot flames. And when the next board meeting rolled around, Harold was suddenly very quiet, and even issued a begrudging statement reevaluating community emergency preparedness options, which basically meant trying to take credit for the same truck he wanted to ban. And I just sat there, camera on, smiling silently as the man who once called my fire truck an urban blight tried to suggest we consider allocating space for emergency vehicles in future planning. And I knew right then the war wasn't over, but the first battle had gone up in smoke. After that night, everything in the neighborhood changed, not suddenly, like the explosion of fire that lit up the HOA's prized cedar fence, but gradually, like smoke rising from the embers of something once thought untouchable. And at the center of it all stood the truck they tried to erase, the man they tried to silence, and the fire they never saw coming. And while I didn't go around gloating or throwing it in anyone's face, the look on Harold's face whenever he passed my driveway where the truck now sat with more pride than ever was enough to know he hadn't just lost an argument. He'd lost control. And that scared him more than flames ever could, because for years he'd ruled this HOA like a petty dictator, making life difficult for anyone who questioned his authority. But now, thanks to a timely combustion and a well-timed fire hose, he couldn't raise his voice without someone reminding him about how he nearly let the whole park burn while trying to get rid of the only piece of firefighting equipment within 10 miles. And you'd think, after such a public embarrassment, he'd have the sense to retreat quietly. Maybe even offer a half-hearted apology, or admit that maybe, just maybe, the rules needed to change to reflect the real needs of the community. But not Harold. No, Harold did what power-drunk people always do when they feel threatened. He retaliated, not with flames, but with paper, ink, and an ever-tightening noose of bureaucracy. And it started innocently enough with a new HOA memo titled Community Vehicle Visibility Guidelines, which proposed stricter limitations on all non-standard vehicles, including RVs, trailers, boats, and of course emergency-style trucks. And while the language avoided saying fire truck, everyone knew who it was aimed at, especially when Harold began personally walking the neighborhood with a tape measure and clipboard, noting things like oversized tires, non-factory paint jobs, and unsanctioned decorative lights. And before long, my neighbors were coming to me angry and confused, asking why Harold was now threatening to fine them for things like leaving a kayak on the side of the garage or parking a utility trailer for more than 2 days. And while I tried to stay out of it, to let people fight their own battles, I realized that by standing up against the HOA once, I had unintentionally become a symbol of resistance. And more than that, people saw me not just as a retired firefighter, but as someone who wouldn't back down, someone who had already proven he was willing to act when others were too afraid to speak. So when I got a knock on my door from a young couple down the street, Mark and Alina, telling me Harold was now trying to fine them $500 for having a temporary carport canopy over their driveway to protect their infant stroller from the sun, something they'd used for over a year with no problem until the fire truck fiasco, I knew this wasn't just personal revenge anymore. This was Harold trying to reassert his grip on a neighborhood that had started to question him. And so I did what Harold feared the most. I organized, and not in the way the HOA was used to, with small complaints and whispers behind curtains, but openly, publicly, with flyers, emails, a petition to recall the board, and a call for a full emergency election citing mismanagement, abuse of power, and failure to act in the best interest of residents. And within 2 weeks, more than 60% of homeowners signed the petition, enough to force a special election according to the bylaws Harold himself had helped write years ago, thinking no one would ever dare to use them. And while Harold tried to stall it with procedural nonsense and veiled threats of legal action, it was too late. The fire had spread, metaphorically this time, through every street, mailbox, and inbox in the community, and people who had once feared fines now spoke openly about the ridiculousness of being told what type of lawn chair they could use or what color their backyard shed could be. And when the election night came, the community clubhouse once surrounded by the now burned fence was packed wall to wall with homeowners eager to cast their vote not just against Harold, but against the culture he had built. And when the final count came in and all 4 board members were officially removed, the cheer that erupted was louder than any siren I'd ever sounded. And even Harold, standing in the back with arms crossed and a jaw so tight it looked like it might snap, couldn't say a word as he watched a younger, more diverse, and far more reasonable set of neighbors step forward to take the reins, including a high school teacher, a small business owner, a retired nurse, and at their unanimous nomination me, the man with the fire truck, now the newly elected HOA vice president and head of emergency preparedness, which was ironic considering I never wanted a position, never wanted to deal with the politics or the power struggles, but realized that sometimes the only way to stop the wrong people from leading is to step up and do it right yourself. And one of the first things we did, in our very first meeting as a board, was vote to permanently amend the HOA vehicle policy to allow emergency equipment owned by residents, along with reasonable exemptions for trailers, campers, and other non-commercial items that pose no threat or eyesore to the community. And as we sat around that table, no longer Harold's fortress of ego, but now a space of actual conversation, it felt like a weight had lifted from the entire neighborhood, like for the first time in years people could breathe, without worrying about a fine showing up in the mail for leaving their trash can out 3 minutes too long. And while Harold still lived in the neighborhood, his influence evaporated, and he mostly kept to himself, no longer marching around with a clipboard or nitpicking his neighbors. And I heard from someone on his street that he'd even covered up his own oversized golf cart with a tarp, as if trying to hide the very symbol of his hypocrisy. And meanwhile, the charred remains of the fence were quietly replaced not with some extravagant cedar wall, but with a simple, open picket design that actually allowed more light into the playground and made the area feel more welcoming. And the board approved a motion to install a small concrete pad next to my driveway, funded by volunteer donations, to serve as an official emergency response staging area, complete with a hose connection, backup water tank, and signage that read Community Fire Response Point. And every time I walked past it, every time I saw kids wave at the fire truck from their bikes or neighbors nod in appreciation, I knew we hadn't just won a fight about parking, we'd changed the soul of the place. We'd reclaimed the neighborhood from the clutches of petty tyranny and turned it into something better. And though I didn't seek recognition, a local newspaper ran a follow-up story months later, titled From Firefighter to HOA Fixer, How One Man and One Truck Changed a Community. And I chuckled reading it, not because of the attention, but because it reminded me that sometimes doing the right thing sets off a chain reaction bigger than you could ever imagine. And now, with every sunrise over my quiet street, the fire truck gleaming in the soft morning light, I smile knowing that what was once seen as a violation had become a beacon, a reminder that common sense, community, and a little courage could outshine even the most stubborn rules. And if a fence had to burn for that to happen, then maybe it was worth every spark.